Usury, the act of lending money with interest. It's nothing new, it's been around whether deemed legal or illegal, moral or immoral, for centuries. Nowadays, it's the backbone of the worldwide economy. An average person might not see anything wrong with such a state of affairs. As a matter of fact, most people participate in it without even considering its roots. They just think of it as a tool, a means of getting a loan or a mortgage, getting a new car, new house. Most people also will go for their entire lives cursing their circumstances, their savings being devalued, there being less and less work opportunities, life being made harder by obnoxious taxes, recessions happening every 15 years. Little do they know that someone is responsible for such a state of affairs. All these individuals responsible have a place in history. They have worked to bring about the exact set of circumstances that we curse nowadays through our financial conquest of the world through usury. But how would usury itself, a pretty narrow concept, manage to be the vehicle for a small group of people to achieve world domination? Well, that's the point of this video. Look how it actually happened. Actually, you know what? Forget about it. In the interest of not getting struck down, this video is just conspiracy theories that are of course untrue. Everything in this video is false and made up. What I'm going to be doing is just making stuff up. And also, another important thing, I'm going to be calling the ethnic and religious group most responsible and known for usury and money lending Brazilians. Because of course you can't call them by their real name and not have your video removed. I mean, if anything, it just proves my point. But whatever. England. This island that was wrought with conflict in the early medieval due to settling and raiding from various post-barbarian people groups, would in the following centuries be at the center of one of the most deceptive and nefarious schemes to ever be devised. But for now, let's focus on how it even came to be. The first monetary system to be constituted entirely within the structures and hierarchies of England and not be dependent on a foreign power like the case of Roman coinage would be created by King Offa that ruled the Kingdom of Mercia in the 8th century. Would go on to be a system based on silver coinage on the account of gold being scarce in the region. One notable thing the king did was he prohibited usury, a decision that his successor would expand on throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, culminating in Edward the Confessor decreeing that any usurer be banished for life. But why did many European rulers, especially in the medieval period, despise usury? Well, one thing is that when you're a monarch trying to consolidate power in your hands, you don't want any aspiring opposition that also wants that power, whether it's the landed nobility seeking to tear you down, or in this case, a growing merchant class. Money knows no morality and no borders, and as history is about to show, these financiers that sprung up from the mercantile class would go on to, in the most clandestine and slimy ways, use that money to bind many to their credit and secure power. This happened because money was, just like it is nowadays, a shortcut to power. and most of the medieval royalty saw these usurers as trying to cheat the system by trying to access power through money without having any heritage, any familial bonds or history with their domains they were expanding into. They were unlawful invaders. Keen medieval rulers saw these moneylenders as dirty players and a genuine threat to security. Another thing was how the Christian church would also take a stance against usury, rooted in the tradition of the greatest European thinkers like Seneca or Aristotle, who claimed that the act of taking interest from money is unnatural and vile. The church would generally abide by these rules in its early years, but it would still participate in a hard to define gray area by, for example, investing into a business or individual and binding that person lawfully to pay out a dividend back to the church officials, and as a result, collecting returns that can't really be called interest but act very much like it, with periodic payments of a sum higher in value than at first invested. Apart from this, the church would for a long time fight usury and recognize the threat it posed to political stability, inspiring many medieval rulers to abide by this doctrine. The first mass arrival of moneylenders in England happened coincidentally with the entrance of Brazilians into the country. I cannot possibly fathom a connection being made between the two, but alas, one thing that has to be noted is the fact of how after the defeat of King Harold II by William the Conqueror in 1066, the victorious Norman king invited the Brazilians to move from their Norman domain into newly conquered England, and for the first time in centuries allowed usury to be practiced on the island under his own protection. The sources, however limited, we could possibly, maybe just could, deduce that he might have received funding from said moneylenders for his campaign, and in return allowed them to expand their financial operation into England. The Brazilians, for the next few centuries, would go on to be under constant royal protection, seeking safety under the wings of the monarch, presumably in return for financial favors or even as a result of straight up financial dependency of the crown upon their money. You cannot underestimate how dependent on funding from the usurers the new Norman aristocracy was, as it was seen for the longest time as a foreign entity by the native English commoners and nobility alike. As a matter of fact, the moneylenders in this period would go on to issue loans with interest rates of up to 33% per year on land mortgaged by the nobles and up to 300% per year on tools with the laborers. Within just over a century since their arrival, they have managed to assume ownership of around 1/4 of all English lands. By his death in the late 12th century, Aaron of Lincoln, a financier, was supposedly the wealthiest man in England on the basis of his liquid assets, trumping the wealth of King Henry II. During this period, the state would go on to become the enforcer of the will of these usurers and would exact payment almost in the exact same way it exacted taxes. The everyday operation of these moneylenders was so successful because ever since they came into England, they were always intertwined and incorporated within the ruling Norman aristocracy. To say that with such a hierarchy being present, the commoners, the clergy, and the nobility alike disliked the Brazilians would be an understatement, culminating in violence erupting around 1190, with many Brazilians being slaughtered and their bonds being burned, freeing up a lot of population from debt. As a result, the monarchy doubled down on exacting the interest of moneylenders, and now each loan taken by a noble was to be registered and its fulfillment was to be keenly followed by the royal authorities. As a result, many nobles falling on hard times would lose their lands and property that would be seized by the king for himself. Discontent with the worsening state of affairs, the nobles would repeatedly revolt, culminating with Edward I being forced to abolish all forms of usury throughout the 13th century and compelling the Brazilian population of 16,511 to leave England forever. It would be just one of the very numerous expulsions of the Brazilians throughout European history and would also by complete coincidence ushering the age of prosperity in England. From the 13th century onwards, England experienced what we could call a golden age, as not only was there no state debt, but the taxes were moderate, pay was decent, and as a result of the many laborers having more free time, with up to 180 days in the year being holidays, we saw the construction of some of Europe's greatest cathedrals. It is said that the living standard of 15th century England would only be surpassed in the 19th century. Unfortunately, with a more strained political situation and complacency from the crown, such a state of affairs would not last, and a blatant disregard to the lessons learned in the past would cause the island nation to spiral and commit the mistake, the consequences of which we can still see to this very day. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. It's the year 1492, and the English are still enjoying a period of relative prosperity, and this year a very notable population of Spanish Brazilians and Moranos, that being Brazilians that converted to Christianity voluntarily or by force, but still practiced their religion in secret, would be banished from Spain. They weren't particularly liked, to say the least, mostly as a result of being seen as traitors because of their alliance and cooperation with the many Muslim rulers which had occupied the Iberian Peninsula from the 8th to the 15th century. With the Reconquista drawing to a successful end, their entire population would be banished and would start seeking new domains to expand into. The thing is, however, money lending was decried as immoral by the church, especially when practiced by a Christian lending money to other Christians. It would become increasingly popular in the highly mercantile seafaring cities on the European shores, even on the overwhelmingly Catholic Mediterranean coast. There were many European and Brazilian banking families in Italy being sheltered by city elites from having to abide by the Christian moral code, being allowed to pay a very low fine that, rather than actually deterring the bankers from practicing usury, made them even more entrenched by whittling away at the smaller aspiring competition. It is very well known that the Vatican would borrow money often from the 14th to the 16th century, going against its own teachings, but one thing that might partially explain this hypocrisy is how four of the popes ruling from the 15th and 16th centuries themselves came from a very influential Italian banking family called Medici. Financiers would bribe the church with preferable rates and donations to keep themselves afloat and flourishing in a highly mercantile economy, and so many popes would shelter usurers under their own wings and rely on them for financial support. But unlike the more secular states of Northern Europe, the Mediterranean bankers would still be trumped in power and reach by the church, always being the stronger institution and very often coming into conflict with the Brazilian banking families, especially when Italian families would have so much influence over the church as to have the Pope from their own family. The existence of such a massive financial institution like the Catholic Church still impeded the growth of bankers not associated with it, and especially the Brazilian ones, them being, of course, seen as competition, and so most Brazilians banished from Spain would seek greener pastures elsewhere. The church, despite its size, would still bend the knee before the financiers later on, as in the 19th century it would become the domain of the Rothschilds. The bankers didn't forget about the church, which for a long time argued against them and was generally a thorn in their side. The Rothschild family would become the treasurers and financiers of the papal state, which translated into a subjugation of the Catholic Church, as they now held the strings over the once great institution. Centuries later, but they still got their revenge. Bear in mind the Rothschild family name, as they will become of paramount importance later down the line. Coming back into the main timeline, the obvious destination for the banished Brazilians at the time was Holland, in generational conflict with the Spanish crown that was encroaching on Dutch soil and messing with Dutch interests. As a result of this political tension, the Dutch would overwhelmingly partake in the Protestant Reformation in opposition to the Catholic Church as it was seen as an extension of the Spanish crown. This anti-Catholicism hailing from the conflict and the dire need for resources and against a formidable opponent and a strong seafaring mercantile economy made the Netherlands a perfect home base for any aspiring financier and banker. Open economies, like the Netherlands at the time, were very reliant on foreign imports to fuel growth, so they ended up very easy to subdue, with that being an easy task of monopolizing the right to issue credit to the people importing said goods by creating private banks, which is what the Brazilians did and still do best. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the Netherlands would enjoy an economic golden age with the Iberian Brazilians bringing huge amounts of capital into the country. Within a few generations, usury and banking would flourish and would dominate the Dutch economy for the next few centuries, with the most influential and wealthy people in the whole Netherlands being the aforementioned moneylenders. The Netherlands would go on to become for the longest time a base of operations for these Brazilian financiers trying to expand their influence, and in this case, they had set their eyes on England. In the 16th century, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, small numbers of Marranos Brazilians, that being nominal converts to Christianity, would start being let into England. That time frame coincided with the rapidly growing financial dependency of European rulers on money lent to them by said usurers, with interest rates on loans to the Crown or Treasury exceeding 20 and 30% per year, and 60 to 80% with loans given to poor workmen, despite the legal limit at the time being only 6% per year. Their entrance into England would also mark the humble beginnings of fractional reserve banking, that being a system where the bank would provide receipts, that being bills of exchange of any form, without covering the full sum of all the money owed to their clients with reserve capital, increasing efficiency and profits, but making the system highly unstable and often fraudulent. But let's focus on the larger political stage during the 16th century, upon close observation of which we can determine a great deal of motives that indicate a great deal of involvement of these foreign moneylenders in English politics. First of all, in 1534, the Church of England was established as an independent entity from the Catholic Church, marking the first crack in English religious unity. If you wanted to, let's say, increase your influence over the English people, you could possibly exploit this newfound division within the church to, under the guise of a religious war, seize the control of the government by picking or creating a side to the conflict and making that side entirely dependent on your funding, and in return they will do your bidding. That's exactly what happened in 17th century England when the flames of religious disunity were fanned with Puritans being agitated against the Anglicans. Another important aspect to keep in mind is how Puritan teachings put Brazilians in a more favorable light due to their strict focus on basing their religious identity on the Old Testament way more than other denominations at the time. Israel Disraeli, father of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, wrote that the nation was artfully divided into Sabbatarians and Sabbath breakers. Soon civil war broke out between the Anglicans and the Puritans, with the latter winning under the command of Oliver Cromwell with his new model army. Cromwell was known as someone, and I quote, particularly well disposed towards the Brazilians, end quote, with whom he had very frequent dealings. Cromwell, because of his strained relationship with the Assembly, had to rely on funding from goldsmiths. It is notable the influence of Amsterdam moneylenders in funding Cromwell's military operation, with names such as Manasseh ben Israel and Fernandes Carvajal having petitioned for the entrance of Brazilians into England and directly arranged financial favors. Cromwell's connection to moneylenders is undeniable, as a letter from him to Ebenezer Pratt, a financier living in Germany, shows how much of what he did was only possible due to the financial support from the Brazilians. In return for financial support, Will advocated the admission of Jews into England. This, however, impossible while Charles still living, Charles cannot be executed without trial, adequate grounds for which do not at present exist. Therefore advise that Charles be assassinated, but will have nothing to do with arrangements for procuring an assassin, though willing to help him in his escape. He would go on to purge the House of Commons in order to make a vote condemning the King Charles to death, and when no English lawyer was ready to draw charges against the king, he enlisted the help of a Dutch lawyer called Isaac Dorislaus. Regicide having taken place, Charles II, the executed king's son, would be the last monarch to issue banknotes entirely within his own right, as he passed two acts that would set in motion one of the most profoundly important transfers of wealth and power in human history. Firstly, in 1663, the Act for the Encouragement of Trade, which allowed exporting of all foreign coin or bullion of gold or silver free of interdict, regulation, or duties of any kind. This meant that foreigners could now accumulate wealth with gold and silver outside of England itself. That meant a transfer of wealth outside the jurisdiction of the Crown and the possibility of creating banks completely independent of the English state. The second act was passed in 1666, called the Act for the Encouragement of Coinage. It gave private individuals, in this case bankers, the right to mint coins within the institutions of the Royal Mint, which allowed these financiers to collect seigneurage, that being profit coming from the difference between the production cost of minting a coin and the perceived market value of that coin, which is usually higher than the production cost, and which in turn allows to take profit from introducing coins to the market. This basically surrendered the control over the money supply to said moneylenders, meaning that they could deflate and inflate the currency to their liking. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. At the dawn of the 17th century, the previously mentioned Charles II had a brother, James II, who would rule for barely 3 years as a result of being overthrown by a Dutch prince, William of Orange. At this point in history, the fact of the Netherlands' role as a base of operations for moneylenders wanting to expand their domain becomes very apparent. What doesn't help their case is how John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough in James II's service, deserted him after receiving a bribe from a Dutch merchant, Solomon de Medina, which weakened the king enough to cause him loss to William of Orange. This seizure of power by the Dutch prince would be another important element to the historical puzzle of central banking, as during his reign he would surrender the right of the crown to issue money free of debt and interest to the private financiers now flooding the country, and would go on to establish the national debt. Let's pause for a moment. How was it that the Brazilian bankers managed to enact so much influence on European rulers and politicians that they always would find or manufacture some person that would do their bidding? First of all, if anything, usury is a very profitable business. It allows to not only sack the poor falling on hard times trying to make ends meet, but also the royalty in desperate need of a cash infusion just to keep them afloat on the political stage. Dire circumstances don't discriminate, and as a result, it allows these morally destitute enough to leech off human misfortune and mistakes. In European history, you could always find a desperate noble, an extremely ambitious aristocrat, important people that need just that one loan, just one monetary infusion to get going again. And that's how you bind not only the poor commoners, but the influential nobles, all the heads of the nations, to your credit, your money, and your influence. Second of all, why were they so successful in subduing state by state? Brazilian morality works different to European morality. They did and still do believe themselves to be superior to outsiders. Not only that, also as a result of that feeling of supremacy, allow for worse treatment of the outsiders of their religion, as according to their scriptures, you can cheat, mistreat, and scam any outsider to their faith. They form extremely hermetic societies, don't assimilate, very rarely marry outside their societies, and as a result accumulate and retain wealth more efficiently. Compare this to a European Christian which was told that all people are going to be judged equally, that to swindle and cheat is in no case acceptable. Christian scripture reinforced a feeling of empathy or pity towards non-believers, not superiority, or didn't make much mention of the God's particular affection towards them, more focusing on universalism. To better see the difference in morality, let me ask you a question. Have you ever seen a Brazilian religious mission? Yeah, me neither. They're more of a closed-in religion but which doesn't focus on preaching to others but rather on keeping that enlightenment within their own societies in a more consolidated familial and tribal structure, as opposed to Christianity, which is based on preaching the truth to as many as possible, trying to allow as many as possible to have a chance at achieving salvation. Implanting these people in a society as a minority will in turn amplify the majority population's hate for the hermetic, non-assimilationist, superiority complex fueled attitude and further stoke the Brazilians' pride and disdain of outsiders. It's a sort of feedback loop where you end up with the natives increasingly disliking the Brazilians for who they are, and vice versa. The Brazilians had the perfect combination of a morality based on in-group loyalty, paired with a disdain of outsiders and a non-assimilationist attitude, combined with being barred from participating in most trades as a result of reciprocal dislike from the natives. They ended up dominating the banking sector while exploiting the weaknesses of the European people bit by bit, trapping entire nations in dependency to their money. Now knowing the brief historical background surrounding this transfer of wealth and power of paramount importance between what we could consider a largely domestic population and a foreign and coordinated influence, we can start approaching the subject to which all of this has been leading up to: the creation of a private central bank in England. The Bank of England would be opened in 1694. It would lend money at interest to the king in order to pursue war, which would rack up further debt and further dependency of the crown on said institution, but also expand the moneylender's usurious domain. Key to understanding the nefarious nature of the establishment of the Bank of England is analyzing the very bill that was passed that made the bank operational was itself passed with only 42 members being present in the House of Commons out of the total 514. Such was the case because the vote was called in the middle of the summer and most members of the House were away in the countryside tending to farming duties, as most of them were rural noblemen. The title of the bill, just like the previously mentioned acts that laid the foundation, made little mention of the intended establishment of the Bank of England, as the bill itself was called an Act granting to their Majesties several rates and duties upon tonnage of ships and vessels, upon beer, ale, and other liquors. It's interesting, why would these people not reveal their intentions to the general public and instead hide and in the most secretive ways try to take over, never revealing their real intentions? It's almost like what they're doing is extremely malicious and is the equivalent of a hostile takeover, with the final goal being the total usurpation of all productivity in a society. What made the bank so disastrous for the English people is it was structured around regulating the money supply, so the issuing of money is being torn away from the government itself and creating a second state within a state, a central bank. The thing is, managing fiscal policy and the treasury is basically the best shortcut to power. You usurp the only meaningful resource in the entire government, more important than the army, more important than any treaty or support of the people. What happened in England was nothing short of just a power transfer, nothing different from taking over the government, except the only thing the financiers did differently is they didn't make any glaring changes to the system and kept the forms of old relevant, with the monarch being supposedly the head of the state. This might be hard to conceive of, but what happened is a hidden government was imposed onto an already existing one. When you control the ability of the state to issue currency, when you control the credit that the state receives, when you manage the state's reserves, you can basically, through this back door, manage every other aspect of the state from commerce to foreign policy. What I'm talking about when I mention the transfer of wealth and power is exactly this: a second ceiling to an already existing government, a usurpation of power from what we can see as the head of the state into the hands of a clandestine group of financiers. Every time a new central bank gets instituted by these Brazilian financiers, what we're talking about is at its core nothing more than a takeover of a government, a subjugation of the entire state apparatus. It is an invasion, but with the difference that it doesn't instantly remove all signs of the old regime, it doesn't depose of old forms of the government, but rather stealthily implants itself into it. Alongside indebting the crown to the moneylenders, the act also introduced numerous new taxes that were supposed to pay interest on all present and future debts, including a land tax, paper tax, poll tax, salt tax, stamp tax, window tax, a tax on births, marriages, deaths, and bachelors, and most importantly, an income tax levied at 20%, applying to all sources of revenue. But what was the real purpose of a bank like this? As a matter of fact, what is the purpose of any other central bank modeled after the Bank of England present today? Were you to believe the mainstream narrative, you'd be told that they provide credit, manage currency, deal with monetary policy, provide stability. But wait, provide stability. Up to this point, they've been only inciting wars and manipulating markets. Why would the state surrender its right to issue currency free of debt and interest? Wouldn't that make for a more flexible fiscal policy? Why does issuing fiat currency carry interest? Why are all of these central banks being instituted by foreigners? It's almost like they're a back door into controlling the government. No, that's crazy. That can be. As a matter of fact, these banks only exist because our ancestors lost the fight with this cabal of financiers. There's no other reason as to why. Only why is that they're chains of dependency. These banks are like watchtowers in a prison. They're monuments to our own subjugation, and when you go through the history of their establishment, they're always instituted through intrigue and force, never merit. By 1722, majority of the bank's shares were owned by such English-sounding family names as de Medina, da Costa, Fonseca, Enriquez, Núñez, Rodriguez, Salvador, and Teixeira de Matos. After the American War of Independence, the national debt soared to £176 million. England would further its debt with each war it fought, and unsurprisingly, there would be many wars against countries that for a long time opposed the creation of a central bank on their lands. Each war would not only give an opportunity for financial expansion for the bankers, but it would also, in and of itself, necessitate increased spending, and as a result would further increase the national debt. And now every central bank from the 18th century through to the 20th century would be created in the image of the Bank of England. But let's go back to the second half of the 17th century, as I want to illustrate an interesting theory. A few years before the Bank of England was established, there already existed a central bank in Sweden, which, unlike the English one, wasn't instituted by the same cabal of financiers, but rather by a merchant named Johann Palmstroop, which wasn't much affiliated with the Brazilian bankers of the Netherlands and England. He was allowed by the Swedish king to take deposits and issue loans, as he would play an important role in financing military expenditures. Okay, knowing that, let's look into how, if you were theoretically in charge of a financial institution, could destroy another financial establishment, your competition. A so-called bank run or bank panic is when the wider public is convinced that a bank is going to fail due to a perceived inability to cover the people's deposits with real money. In simple terms, many banks back then were, and especially going into the modern period, are fractional reserve banks, meaning that they only hold a small reserve of actual cash relative to the people's deposits and loans. In any fractional reserve bank, if every or even every other person that has money deposited in said bank was to demand a payout of that money, that bank would not have the capital to do it, as most of it is locked in investments, bonds, securities, and debt, so only a fraction of cash remains as actual reserves, With normal traffic, that system works fine, as people generally don't demand huge withdrawals, and if they do, the bank will in due time transfer that money into the reserve and into the hands of the customer. But when a rumor compelling people of the bank's financial trouble is spread or general instability is present, indicating a possibility that of the money that you deposited at that bank being at risk, people will in turn resort to as quickly as they can withdrawing as much money as they can from said bank as a response to save what they can. The problem lies in the very fact that every fractional reserve bank won't have full cover of all deposits, and a simple rumor is enough to cause insolvency and collapse a bank. Now, the Stockholm's Banco, as it was called in its final iteration, would pioneer the use of banknotes to cover for its small and fragile reserves. You see, this was a fractional reserve bank, meaning it only kept a small amount of reserves in copper, silver, and gold relative to the amount of loans and banknotes it was issuing. This model wasn't particularly new at the time and would go on to completely dominate global banking in current times, but in the 17th century it was still pretty primitive and potentially very volatile and unstable. Key to understanding the story is remembering that the Stockholm Banco was a largely independent initiative and as a result would be targeted by the English-Dutch financial establishment in a more or less directed effort to uproot their competition. First of all, the English-Dutch speculators would manipulate the price of copper in Sweden, which the bank heavily relied on for its reserves, as Sweden employed a largely copper-backed currency. Second of all, after causing the copper prices to fall, the speculators rushed to get their banknotes exchanged into copper, which the bank didn't have enough in its reserves due to poor risk management, combined with the exploitation by the speculators of the very fractional reserve nature of the bank. This caused a liquidity crisis when people learned about the insolvency of the bank and even more worsened the situation by attempting to withdraw all their deposits at once, which even a healthy fractional reserve bank wouldn't be able to do, and especially one being heavily speculated against by an organized force. This resulted in a panic and collapsed the establishment, on the bones of which a central bank sprung up, owned and managed by individuals associated with the English-Dutch banking establishment. You want to know what sort of political system is most oppressive to the common man? It's one where the masses don't even know who is in charge, and guess what? That's exactly the position that the bankers have secured for themselves. Usually we think of all sorts of absolutist regimes, totalitarian states, as the worst when it comes to the treatment of its people, but in such systems, the ruler, the government, or the party, it's still vulnerable. The people know and see clearly where their oppression is coming from, and they can focus their anger against them. But with bankers, they're not public personalities. They don't show themselves at all. They remain hidden behind the governments they have taken over. As a result, the oppressed people only know to blame the government and politicians, which can be deposed as quickly as they were instituted. The financiers can just create another government, another monarch, another party. This is the most oppressive form of government, because every bout of dissatisfaction from the masses is focused against a disposable entity and not the real source of suffering and injustice. The bankers, as a result, can get away with ruining people's livelihoods through recessions, bank runs, inflationary and deflationary spirals, revolutions, wars, supply shocks, pamphleteering, speculation runs, because in each case, the people will be manipulated into blaming a scapegoat like the government or another country. They're simply untouchable, because how can you fight someone you don't even know exists? With England and Sweden now under the financiers' control, they set their sights on two particular countries, the US and France. Their North American endeavors, which are probably the most relevant ones today, are too complex to just tack onto this video and will be talked about in detail in the second part. But the French episode warrants a look into as it will set the stage for their future world domination. Going into the 18th century, history of Western Europe was going to witness an ironic sequence of events. Remember the Norman conquest of England, which introduced a large scale organized usury into England? Well, in a sick twist of fate, the English, or rather the many bankers now holding considerable power over the crown, would try for almost a century to establish a centralized usurious system of banking in France. An interesting turn in the history of European banking is the story of the Royal Bank of France that sprung up after the death of the infamous Sun King, Louis XIV. It was established by a Scotsman called John Law with the permission of the state and became the first ever central bank in France in 1718. The key factor in this scenario is the fact that said bank most likely didn't receive support from the English-Dutch financial establishment and most likely was a largely independent affair, just like the Stockholm's Banco, which also was seen by said banking establishment as competition. What supports this theory is the fact that merely 2 years later, the bank went under as a result of a panic being spread around about the bank's supposed inability to cover its banknotes with gold and resulted with people withdrawing their deposits and actually causing insolvency problems. The search for perpetrators guilty of sinking the first central bank of France has led many to believe that the Bank of England was behind it, as in the coming decades during the French Revolution, they counterfeited French currency and caused financial chaos, seeing any independent bank in France as a direct threat to their monopoly. Leading up to the revolution, almost 50% of the state expenditures were allocated to paying interest by the French state. Private banks, operating all throughout France, would soon have their influence curbed by one ambitious Frenchman. Napoleon was known as a particularly astute political leader who would keenly observe and fight any attempts at instituting a foreign bank on French soil. He believed it was imperative to keep foreign financiers out if you want a prosperous and strong state, and instituted a bank that he would have notable influence over, as he made himself president of the bank. He abolished the rights of rival private banks to issue banknotes and supervised the creation of money and credit. On the side note, people think that every country that exists and is relevant to some extent has to have national debt, that the head of a state being financially bound to moneylenders is just a natural course of action. The case couldn't be any further from the truth. There have been many countries that went for long periods of time with the heads of state not having to borrow any money. This mainstream economic take that if you want to run a politically relevant country, you have to have an institution of national debt makes little historical sense, as Napoleon, for example, in order to finance his wars all over Europe, did everything to not fall into debt. He sold Louisiana to the United States. He subsisted off of looting his armies did. The French economy was also in genuinely good shape, managing to become very self-reliant and productive. Not to mention the fact that having control over your own state bank allows you to have a very flexible fiscal policy that weathers foreign manipulation and subterfuge to a large degree. Napoleon was his own banker and financed his campaigns almost entirely by way of production or acquisition instead of borrowing. If this guy, during when most of Europe was against him, still managed to avoid unnecessary debt for the longest time, I think it gives good evidence that the national debt doesn't have to be a necessary evil that exists, as some say, that every aspiring country has to participate in. To say that the financiers behind the Bank of England were fuming at such a display of financial sovereignty would be an understatement, as according to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, the Rothschilds pledged £100 million to the anti-French coalition during the Napoleonic Wars. After Napoleon's defeat and subsequent comeback at Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild financed all of the belligerents, including France herself, skillfully indebting all the sides and yet making Napoleon lose. So, after all of this, what's the big thing about usury? Well, one thing is that through it expressed itself a force that went on to seize absolute power all over the world. That's gonna be the subject of part 2, but what's relevant is the fact that nobody knows about this, that nobody understands who holds actual power over Western governments, that the masses pick and choose their leaders but have no idea that who they're electing to power still serves bankers first. I think it's our fault that we got swindled like this. That's what happens when you make mistakes. The fact that these financiers managed to assume power like this is quite frankly astonishing, as through methodically eroding away at the power structures of the West, they've managed to completely ensnare it. The fact is that we can learn from these mistakes. But what's the point of it, since all of these events have already played out? The lesson from this video is not that usury itself is some sort of a greatest evil, as these financiers didn't just achieve power through money lending alone. Usury was always a stepping stone. They expanded, they swindled, they conquered, they used every political trick there is to get where they are now. I don't want the takeaway from this video or the second part to be that usury is lay bad, but rather that people that used it as a means to an end are vile. If you wonder why the world is in such a dysfunctional state, look no further than the history of central banking and the people behind it.